Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. My guest today is Evan Nierman, founder and CEO of Red Banyan, an award-winning strategic communications firm. With 25 years in crisis and reputational management, Evan has led top executives, public figures, higher ed presidents, global brands, and political figures through complex, high-stakes challenges to their reputation and communications. With all the reputational challenges and negative publicity that higher ed is facing, e.g. cost, value, Epstein, whatever, I thought it'd be a great idea to have someone like Evan on the program to let him give us the background of what higher ed communications needs to be, what communications and crisis communications are, and how we can deal with these things going forward. Evan, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.
I am as well. This is going to be a great conversation, I think. One, because of the personality and who you are. You're a communicator par excellence. We're also talking about crisis communications, which is one of those things that everybody needs to know about, but nobody wants to talk about. So I'm looking forward to having a good conversation.
Well, hopefully I won't disappoint you.
Oh, you will not. I have no doubt about that. Before we get into the topic, please give the listeners a little bit of your background, if you would.
Sure. Hello, I'm Evan Nierman. I'm the founder and CEO of Red Banyan. We are a strategic communications firm with a unique expertise in high-stakes, rapid response PR, also known as crisis communications. And all the time people ask me, how did you get into this unique line of work? Well, the answer is I spent the first 15 years of my career in Washington, D.C., so there's no better to learn about all manners of crisis than within the Beltway in our nation's capital. And since that time, I've worked both in-house in various communications positions for a startup, for an advocacy organization, and I've worked on the agency side, mostly for small, nimble, boutique firms focused on high stakes and crisis communications, which is when I set out to launch Red Banyan about 16 years ago, I wanted to create the kind of firm that I was looking for when I was trying to get a job and didn't really find what I was looking for. So I figured, you know what, I'll go out and build it myself. And that was to create the kind of firm that really takes a vested interest in the outcomes for our clients, that's an extension of their teams, and is just relentless, nimble, really a special operations type approach to communications challenges. And not just getting people out of the media, but also the flip side is helping them power their reputation, get their story out. So both proactive, positive PR, as well as reactive, high stakes, rapid response communications.
Well, you're absolutely right. Washington is a great place to learn that type of thing. When you were on the Hill or in DC, I know you've worked a lot in higher ed now, but is that where you got your start with higher ed?
Touched on it a little bit, working with academics, taking part in both from the university side as well as with think tanks, which obviously employed a lot of people who were academics and instructors, adjunct professors and full-time professors at George Washington, Georgetown, American, et cetera. It was my first taste and exposure to it, but the work that I've done related to higher ed has mostly come in the 16 years that I've been at the helm of Red Banyan.
Well, we all know that higher ed isn't doing particularly well right now with all of the challenges going on, especially the political and, as you termed it, the cancel culture. It's worse than ever, isn't it?
It's definitely a challenging time. I think there's kind of a series of elements that are creating a perfect storm for higher ed. There's definitely a major shift in terms of how people are going about getting jobs, what sort of skills are going to define the optimal worker in the coming century. And there's more questioning, I think, at this time than ever before about the value of traditional higher education degrees, with a lot of people in the startup world basically saying, you don't need to get a degree, you don't need to go to school. I want people who know how to use the tools. Obviously, AI is a game changer as well. It changes the whole paradigm. And I think that there's also a degree of trust being at an historic low when it comes to institutions of higher ed. And I think we saw that back to all roads always lead back to Washington. We saw that on the screens of our televisions and on the front pages of websites for major newspapers, where you had heads of colleges and universities dragged before Congress talking about highly controversial issues, including anti-Semitism on campus and what institutions were and weren't doing to protect students. So I just think there's all these different things taking place at the same time. And higher ed needs to be thinking about high stakes and crisis communications in a way that they never have before, because it's not just a matter of institutional reputation, but there's revenue and dollars at stake too, both in terms of the students paying to go to your school or choosing not to because they have some sort of a feeling about the institution, and also questions about the degree to which the federal government may or may not be an ally to higher ed.
Yeah, good point there. We'll revisit that one at another time, maybe.
Sure.
How did we get here? There's a lot of different opinions out there, and I've got a few of my own, but how did we get to this point?
Well, I think the country is really at an inflection point. And I think if you look at where we are today versus where we were even 20, 25 years ago, it's markedly different. And one, I think there's a hyper connectedness that exists because we're growing up in the age of the internet. News spreads very, very quickly. A story that may have taken days or weeks or months to germinate in the past can go viral in a matter of moments. You've got also people self-selecting where they get their news and information to a degree that's never existed before. So you have people finding themselves in echo chambers. They latch on to a certain philosophy or viewpoint, and then they feed themselves a steady diet, or the social media and other sites, the algorithms keep giving them more of what they want to consume. So it ends up being a self-fulfilling prophecy. Someone who goes down the rabbit hole of a certain viewpoint just gets more and more indoctrinated and surrounded by like-minded individuals, and it starts eliminating their ability to even hear an opposing side. I think that fragmentation is out there. And I believe also there's hyper-partisanship in a way that's never existed before. And so people are less likely to hear the other side.
And to me, that brings up, and I'll put my university hat back on again. To me, that brings up the criticality of a liberal arts education to be able to look at all perspectives rather than just whatever party is in vogue at the particular time. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And to a large extent, we've lost our way as a society placing prime value on a liberal education. By liberal education, I don't mean progressive. I'm not talking politics. I'm talking about we as a country being open to having a marketplace of ideas where students are taught how to think critically, to formulate arguments, to consider arguments from the opposing side, to weigh the information, whether or not they want to choose to believe it, to challenge it. And I think kids are increasingly growing up with the inability to do that for some of the reasons that I was just describing in terms of where they're consuming a steady diet of the same thing day in, day out.
Yeah, it's kind of like a broken record, or you get I'm sorry, I'm dating myself on this one. You get the old vinyl records that have got to skip, and you keep hearing the same, talk to me, talk to me, talk to me. And you don't get past that. And it gets burned into your grooves of your brain so much that that's all you can hear.
That's absolutely true. I agree with you.
So crisis communication is happening much more frequently than ever, and for all the reasons you just mentioned. How do you define crisis communications?
Well, I think of a lot of times, it's a great question, and I get this all the time, because sometimes I'll talk with an individual who maybe their institution is facing a circumstance and someone suggests that they reach out to Red Banyan. I have a conversation with them and they go, oh, well, you're a crisis communications firm. We're not in a crisis. And by that, I think there's an old school way of looking that the thought is a very narrow definition of a crisis. My definition is considerably broader. I would argue that A crisis is any circumstance with the potential to negatively impact reputation and or revenue.
Yes.
And I think people have really come around to this idea in a way that they hadn't in the past. It is not a matter of if, it is when. Every institution, every private company, every school and university, really even most individuals at some point are going to face a challenge to their reputation or revenue. And so it's incumbent upon them in this hyper-connected world where information travels quickly and where you have to drive the message and you have to shape it. You have to advocate for yourself. So if you're at a college or university and there's a narrative that's taking hold in the public, you have to fight to defend your reputation, to challenge misperceptions, to challenge misinformation or disinformation. Because if you're not willing to tell your story, no one's going to tell it for you. And there's no one better equipped than you to tell your story.
We see this time and time again, and you brought up a couple of good examples, anti-Semitism, things along those lines that are hurting higher ed reputation. It's the politicalization, I believe, of what's been going on for so long. But with that, how do you define what a crisis is versus what isn't a crisis?
Well, as I just said, a crisis is really anything with the potential to negatively impact your reputation or your revenue. And one of the challenges that organizations have is deciding if and when they're going to respond in a public fashion. And that's really something that institutions grapple with. I think in the past, there was maybe a tendency to leave well enough alone, to err on the side of caution, to hope that if you don't comment on something, that what you're doing is avoiding giving oxygen to a fire that's just starting to get kindled. But I think the equation really has changed in this modern age. And I think it's really incumbent to turn that conventional wisdom on its head and to err on the side of being an advocate for yourself and weighing in. Because unfortunately, people are forming opinions and they're going based on the information that's available. And so if you as an institution aren't wading in, even on these sometimes uncomfortable conversations, if you're not driving the narrative and you're not putting out where you actually stand, then you're ceding the battleground to others who are characterizing your institution's perspective. Maybe they're criticizing you. And while I think within academia, a lot of times there's a hesitancy to even engage with things that you think you don't want to dignify it even with a response. I think unfortunately in this world, it's very rough and tumble and you got to get in the fight. You can't afford to be on the sidelines.
Yeah. Give me an example of something like that that's happened within the last 6 to 12 months.
Within the realm of higher education or just anywhere or in the marketplace?
Higher ed.
Okay, now you're putting me on the spot here.
One I can think of is UCLA and the being accused of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, well, look, it's not unique to the UC system. That's a good one to seize upon because I think it's been a bit of a quandary for a lot of institutions, and I think they've grappled with it. And I think in some instances, colleges and universities have been perhaps unfairly criticized because they weren't necessarily condoning anti-Israel or anti-Semitic sentiment, but they were failing to act against it. And in other instances, you absolutely saw circumstances where colleges and universities permitted things to happen that should have been patently unacceptable. I saw a circumstance play out within my own alma mater, George Washington University, where they had someone stand up. And this was I think this is a good sort of illustration of where we are. You had a major problem on a lot of colleges and universities of people getting up at graduations and turning the graduation ceremonies into opportunities to deliver political speech. And the hot topic for the last couple of years on the colleges and universities and for a lot of activist graduates has been talking about conflict in the Middle East and using the graduation ceremony as an opportunity to deride Israel. And I think that far too many institutions were unprepared to confront this phenomenon. And I think they didn't, frankly, know how to handle it. And their absence of decisive action to set real parameters around what is and what isn't acceptable, both in terms of behavior and rhetoric, led to people getting up and hijacking what should have been an inclusive celebratory occasion for all graduates, and instead turning it into a politically divisive event where you had people focusing on one side, pro-Palestine, and being activists in that way, and then others who perhaps are Jewish or supporters of Israel feeling like they're being marginalized or attacked at the same graduation ceremony. And I think I looked at what happened in actually the same liberal arts college that I went to within GW, and at the graduation ceremony, one of the graduates got up and delivered this absolutely ridiculous, one-sided condemnation of Israel. And rather than, it was clear to me that the college didn't know how to handle this and hadn't properly planned, because when she finished her remarks, the dean of the school got up and said, "Oh, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today." Whereas what they should have done was cut off the speaker, mention that it was unacceptable and inappropriate. And I think the failure to act led to so many other colleges and universities where that behavior was then mimicked, modeled, and took a problem that could have been nipped in the bud, and instead it proliferated.
Yeah. Which brings us to an interesting part of the conversation. This is something that should have been thought through prior to it happening. So one of the things that I really gained from you when we spoke a couple of weeks ago was, in dealing with a crisis, you've got to prepare ahead of time. You've got to go through the risk planning aspects. Let's go down that path a little bit.
Absolutely. It's incredible to me. People believe that a crisis is something that's like a bolt of lightning that comes out of nowhere. You have no idea where it's going to strike. You can't adequately prepare for it. It's just, you're just sitting around waiting, and then nature takes its course. And nothing could be further from the truth when it comes to crisis, because most colleges and universities can pinpoint with a high degree of accuracy where they're most likely to find themselves confronting a challenging circumstance. And so you can absolutely game out and plan for crisis situations. And I think far too often, and I'm perplexed because I interact with colleges and universities as well as loads of private businesses. And I think there's an unwillingness that's almost psychological in some cases to want to talk about all that could go wrong, and a reluctance to even go through that uncomfortable exercise. And so as a consequence, many times that planning doesn't happen. And a lot of institutions believe, oh, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But if you're trying to put out a fire, you want to have a plan in advance. You don't want to be figuring out your evacuation plan and your crisis mitigation at the very moment your house is burning down.
Yeah, you need a fire extinguisher standing by right away.
Absolutely. And so if an organization and an institution is willing, they can game out with a high degree of certitude the types of scenarios they're likely to face. You may not be able to pinpoint every single detail, but you'll have a pretty good idea of the nature of the crisis, of thing you could face, and you can have a playbook ready to go, which maybe isn't 100%, but it's 90% of the way there, giving you a little freedom to improvise and adapt and make game time decisions on the other 10%.
This is the same thing that we tell folks in doing strategic planning. It's not the plan that is the great thing that comes out of that. It's all the conversation, the discussion that happens as you're coming to that plan, because there is your gaming out of the various scenarios, your risk planning that potentially planning out for the risk that potentially could happen. It sounds like the same sort of thing.
Yeah, the bulk of the work should actually happen before you ever have a crisis. Not only is it good from a strategic perspective, from when you're talking dollars and cents and a financial investment, it's actually, this is a circumstance where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You will spend far less money, and I'm talking about hard dollars, doing crisis preparations, building a crisis plan, training some of the people on campus in order to handle a crisis situation, then what you'll end up spending when you call Red Banyan or a firm like ours, when you're already in trouble and the media is knocking down your doors and the alumni association is getting involved and the administration is arguing with in a public way or private way with the faculty or the students. So much of this can be mitigated before you even get into the crisis scenario.
Should there be a crisis response team? Should you have a small cadre of folks who have already talked through these things? They know what their roles are supposed to be if something like this comes up?
100%, which then begs the important question, who's going to be on that team? And I think the answer to that is you need someone at the highest level in terms of an executive leadership, whether that's the college president or whatever the provost, whatever the title is. You're going to need someone who handles legal aspects for the college or the university, the institution. So you've got executive function, you've got the legal function. You're going to want someone who deals with whatever arena is unique to that circumstance. So for instance, if it's a scandal or a crisis involving athletics, you're going to want someone who deals with athletics as opposed to just a generalized head of a college. You're also ideally going to want a well-trained and prepared media representative, meaning of someone who would be forward-facing to the media, a spokesperson of some sort. And that person typically comes from either the marketing or the communications department of the institution. And it's often very beneficial to have an outsider sitting in that room as well. And by that, I mean a crisis manager who deals with these circumstances day in, day out, isn't seeing things from a limited viewpoint. Sometimes in the midst of a crisis, you're too close to it. And having that outside perspective can be really, really beneficial. In some cases also, other than the in-house legal counsel, it's advantageous or advisable that you're going to want to have outside counsel, whether it's outside general counsel or attorneys who are brought on to deal with that specific circumstance. But the idea is you want to have your bases covered, but not have such a large group that you can't get things done and done quickly, because speed and strategy are almost equally important. I would say you never want to sacrifice the strategy or doing the right thing by doing the fast thing, but you've got to be able to move at breakneck speed in today's world.
So who should be the spokesman? I think I just heard you say it should be somebody out of your communications department who's trained in this type of thing, but normally it defaults to the president or the chair of the board. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, no two circumstances are 100% identical, but I think I would recommend in most situations, you want to have someone who's a professional communicator, someone who is well-trained, has been media trained, who's comfortable interacting with the press, is comfortable ideally speaking to all different types of reporters, print reporters, online outlets, someone who's also ideally comfortable appearing on camera. That's very important too. It's a different skill set to get on camera and deliver very crisp, very polished, quick sound bites of information versus someone who would go into more detail and provide more context if you're dealing with a written publication or an online outlet. But I think it's a mistake to assume that it's going to be the president or the chairman or chairwoman of the board and to put them into that role. Whereas I'm not diminishing their importance and their centrality in figuring out what the institution is going to do. And sometimes it may be appropriate when you release public statements, et cetera, it should be done in the name of or attributed to that person. But in terms of the day-to-day, you need someone who's available at the drop of a hat to return a reporter's phone call, to field inquiries, et cetera. And so 9 times out of 10, that means you need a communications person, not just the most senior tenured person.
In doing this type of thing, people may be attacking you. There's multiple stories out there. One of the things that I really got from you when we spoke last time was reframing what the communications need to be. The most important thing to a university really is its reputation. So walk me through how you would reframe communication. For example, Epstein that's been a huge bugaboo for many, many institutions. So
Yes.
how do you reframe something like that?
Well, the messaging, absolutely, for every institution, having what I would describe as your core messaging about whatever the topic du jour is, as well as the institution, is very, very important. And you don't want to be robotic or repetitive about driving your talking points, but yet you need to be very clear-eyed and have a clear message about who you are as an institution and what's the position that you're taking related to the controversy. Now, I agree with you that reputation is fundamental. That's why I actually think that PR is dead. PR in the sense of public relations. I think about PR now as powering reputation, because a reputation is something that takes a lifetime to build, but can be eviscerated in mere moments. For that reason, institutions should be focused on preserving their reputation at all costs, because once that starts to take a hit, it can crumble and it's very, very hard to rebuild. I think the Epstein matter has been one of the most difficult topics to grapple with for colleges and universities. And in part, that has to do with just the fact that Epstein was so prolific in terms of his contacts and his connections, not just with Harvard, but with lots of other institutions. And then when you take Jeffrey Epstein and his interconnected huge web of contacts with influential people who then by extension touch so many other institutions, colleges, universities, alumni organizations, booster clubs that are not officially affiliated with the college or university, but are still connected. He is reputational dynamite. Even from the grave, he is continuing to destroy people's reputations simply by people or institutions finding themselves in proximity or with any contact to Jeffrey Epstein. And so I think it's a unique circumstance where he is so toxic that colleges and universities are really struggling with how can they, if they weren't directly connected with Jeffrey Epstein, many of them are finding themselves under fire because there were people who were donors to their institution who were found, their names came up in the Epstein files. Now, I'm going to say something a little controversial here, so brace yourself. Okay. Guilt by association is not the same thing as being convicted in a courtroom. And the conviction of the heart by students or faculty who are upset that someone was connected to Jeffrey Epstein and also connected to that institution does not hold the same power as a conviction in a courtroom. And so I think I would caution colleges and universities not to rush to throw out the baby with the bathwater, to denounce, to deride, to strip the names off of buildings from donors simply because those individuals were connected in some way with Jeffrey Epstein. But again, I think this speaks to they have to protect their reputation, but they need to do so in a way. To me, all of these efforts around what they're going to do vis-a-vis other people whose names may be in the Epstein files or they're connected, they're kind of missing the point. Colleges and universities should be using that opportunity to talk about their own values, who they are, what they're about, not necessarily rushing to step into that morass or allowing people to critique, criticize, and blast them or hold them to a certain standard based solely upon the fact that they had a donor or someone who built a building, who donated to build a building on campus, who was connected to Jeffrey Epstein.
Well said. And not that controversial, actually.
You'd be surprised. I've gotten a lot of hate mail, a lot of hate emails, and a lot of people saying that by me taking the position that simply being associated with Epstein doesn't mean that you were a participant or knowledgeable of his demonic deeds. There are a lot of people who think I'm somehow an apologist for his crimes or what he did. That's not the case at all. It's horrific. I decry it and condemn it in the strongest terms possible. But again, I do think, and this is one of the things about the kind of work that I do, is I'm called upon to represent individuals who are accused many times. An accusation is not a conviction. And we know that in this world where cancel culture continues to be a problem, there is an immediate rush to judgment by so many people in society. And there's often a pile on online. There are people who want to get involved in a controversy. They want to take strident. They err on the side of being strident. They want to insert themselves in a conversation. They want to demand the most far-reaching action, like, you got to fire this professor. You've got to call on this university president to resign. It's typically these really strident, far-reaching things that they want because they want to feel like they're doing something. They want to feel like they're a part of the news and the hot topic of the day. But I just think it's really dangerous. And I think people should avoid a rush to judgment until facts are known, because at the end of the day, everybody deserves due process.
Thank you. Well said. What kind of crisis can we expect this year and next year, or maybe probably through 2028?
There's going to be so many, and you'll see that this field has just really exploded in recent years. When I used to tell people I did high stakes crisis communications, they'd never heard of it before. They didn't know it was a thing to be a crisis communications person. It continues to proliferate because of all the things that we've talked about today. But I think AI is going to produce a whole new generation of work for crisis communications. Deepfakes and AI, the ability to manipulate video, and to, we're now living in this surreal moment in time where it used to be seeing is believing, but now we can't even rely on that. You can hear someone's voice, you can see the video, and what your mind is telling you is this is real, but it's actually computer generated. Mm-hmm. And I think we're entering a really dangerous territory, and we're seeing here at Red Banyan, we're getting more and more deep fake cases that we're dealing with where people are being accused of things and there are recordings of them doing things that they didn't actually do. I think that's going to be a big area for crisis communications. Another subset of communications and high stakes communications that I think is going to come out of AI has to do with the data centers that are going to be built in order to power our capabilities in this arena. We're already seeing that in many places, there's an outcry by people in the public. They're really opposed to the construction, the building of these data centers, sometimes for legitimate reasons, sometimes for completely false and made up reasons. But I think that's an area of crisis I would look at for some time to come. And I do think AI is going to provide a lot of unique crises for higher ed, because I think by and large, the approach that's been adopted towards AI by most educational institutions, not all of them, but most, is that they see AI as cheating, as something that students are using in order to get away with not doing their work, to plagiarize, et cetera. I think a better use of time would be figuring out how to teach the students how to employ AI so that they can be highly employable when they leave college and universities and they go to get jobs in the real world. I think it's one of these areas where I think academia sometimes can move too slowly, and there's too much blowback at the moment against AI, as opposed to rapidly figuring out how are we going to teach our students and our faculty how to use it. This is the world that we're going to be living in. And so we need to be teaching things like critical thinking. And this comes back to a topic we were talking about at the beginning of our discussion. People need to understand how to evaluate information, how to formulate arguments, how to challenge information that may be out there. All of that comes from knowing both how to use the tools, but to use them in a way that's discerning and smart and strategic.
Yeah, well said. Evan, this has been a fabulous conversation. I love these kind of topics, so I thank you so much for being on, as we always do. 3 takeaways for presidents, boards. What do they need to know?
All right. 1, the single most valuable asset that you possess as an institution is reputation. You need to protect it. You need to preserve it. You need to invest in powering your reputation. 2, the time to deal with a crisis is before you have one. You can absolutely prepare in advance. If you haven't already put together a highly detailed crisis communications plan, if you haven't media trained key people, if you don't have a specific set of operating principles and policies and procedures for what you're going to do when you find yourself in a crisis, then you're putting yourself behind the eight ball and there's no need for it. And the third would be when the time comes, because it's not a matter of if, it's when, you need to be strategic and you need to be speedy. You cannot afford to move at the normal pace that academia typically does. We are in a fast-paced, media-driven environment, and so it may be unnatural and it may feel like you're going against your DNA, but you need to put yourself in a position to move quickly to make the right decisions. So those are the three.
Those are great. Thank you. What's next for you, Red Banyan?
Well, we're going to keep doing what we do. So I'm not going anywhere. I'm 48 years old. I intend to continue doing this work for quite some time. For me, this isn't a job. This is my passion. It's my life's mission. My calling is to help great organizations and great people who find themselves in challenging circumstance. And so I'm excited for what the future holds. I'm an eternal optimist. I do think we've lived through a very rocky time in the country. I think there's been a lot of tumult. I think there's a lot of political instability, a lot of infighting. I continue to believe that in the coming years, somehow we're going to find a way to come back together as a country. And this extends across all industries. And my hope is we're going to get back to not treating one another as the enemy or the other, or you're on this team and I'm on that team, and never shall we even communicate with each other because we're on different sides. My hope is that I'm going to bear witness in the coming years to us finding more common ground in the country and people finding a way to tone down the rhetoric, to be a little bit smarter, a little bit more forgiving. And certainly my hope is that we're gonna get back to understanding that we as a nation have so many more things in common that should be uniting us and not dividing us. And so that's my hope and my wish. And so when you say, where are we going? I certainly hope that that's where we as a country are going.
Thank you. Those are great words, and I couldn't have said them any better. I share that hope with you. Evan, thank you so much for being on the program. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening today, and a special thanks to my guest, Evan Nierman. Evan, thanks for a great conversation, great information. Thank you so much. Look forward to the next time our paths cross. To my listeners, thanks again for tuning in. See you next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.